We're now live. Okay, well, good afternoon. Welcome to Primate Conversations. It's a real pleasure today to have Lucy Baehren give us a talk about her dissertation work on leave-taking in primates. Lucy's a PhD candidate here in the School of Anthropology at the University of Oxford. She's now in the final stages of her PhD research, very advanced, about to finish quite soon. Has been working with Susana Carvalho and Harvey Whitehouse with research in the area of comparative primatology, focusing on the study of leave-taking behaviors in human and non-human primates. Lucy has a Master of Science in Primate Behavior and Conservation from Liverpool John Moores University, and a BA in Biological Anthropology from the University of Cambridge. She's also a very active participant in the primate models for behavioral evolution lab here in Oxford, and part of our project, the Paleoprimate Project Gorongosa, where she has conducted fieldwork in Gorongosa National Park in Mozambique. And we're very much looking forward to her talk today. So Lucy, thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Renee. I will just share my screen now. I think, is this working from your end? I think so.
Yes, it's working on this end, yes.
I think it's gone slightly askew. There we go, that's better. Thank you everyone for listening today and coming to the talk. I'm particularly excited to be here. As Renee said, I've been in the primate models lab for a few years doing my PhD, and listened avidly to all of the primate conversations talks. So it feels especially a real honor to be here today giving my own talk about some of the research I've done. Excuse me. And yes, today I'm excited to introduce you to some of the first results from my PhD. At the minute I'm working on writing up the rest of it, but this is kind of the first installment and some of the first exciting results. So it feels like this has been a long time in the making, and I hope that you will find it interesting and ask lots of good questions to help me kind of wrap up the project fairly soon. So I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey today. I'm going to talk to you about the background of the project, about the topic of leave taking as a rather understudied area in primate behavior and more widely. I'll talk to you a bit about some of the research problems, not research questions. Notably this here that I'm referring to in the second hexagon is the literal problems with some of this research, which is what I've been tackling and how to address those. And then I'm going to zoom in a bit on the baboon case study that I've been working on so far, trying to apply some of these ideas, how we conceptualize leave taking, and how we kind of work on this in practice. And then I'll share with you some of the results that I've got so far, and kind of wrap that up with some of the implications. So I'm very excited to begin reinventing the framework for leave taking. Here we go. As some of you may know that have listened to some of my talks, or some people in the lab may have heard various aspects of this before, leave taking is incredibly understudied, in my opinion. Greeting, on the other hand, what happens when we come together, when we say hello, is quite well studied. And this is how the idea first came to me, was this discrepancy between what we know about greeting that's fairly well understood and leave taking that seems basically ignored. And I've summed that up with a quote from Knapp here in 1973. How transactions are terminated has been largely neglected by behavioral researchers. And I'll talk a bit more about kind of why that might be in a little bit, but yes, it still seems to be the case. Not a huge amount has changed since 1973, in fact. But we do get a bit of interesting evidence from various disciplines. And that's what also makes this research project quite interesting, I think, because what we do have from the literature spans a range of disciplines. So I'm going to talk you through a bit about that first. Beginning with the cross-cultural evidence, I've tried to illustrate this today with some pictures so that you weren't totally overwhelmed by text. let me just talk you through this now. So Baehren in 1968, he claims that leave-taking is universal, and we see this throughout the leave-taking literature, this idea that we assume it's universal, like we assume greeting is universal. It happens in lots of different cultures, maybe in slightly different ways, but Baehren says that the basic form and function is the same. We also get some insights into how things vary across cultures. So Hong, for example, says that there is variation in the religious reference of how we say goodbye. Attica more recently has said that the amount of empathy and leave-taking varies between cultures. Some are very warm and very empathetic, and some less so. And Akindele has a few claims, some of which are that age and sex makes leave-taking vary, and some are that even time of day can affect how we say goodbye. And I've also put Batholia in there as well. This is quite an interesting one that I've come back to a lot while I've been doing this project, because they claim that the early Meitei and a group in India, actually, when they were a smaller, more close-knit society, actually had very little or even no leave-taking. So that's quite interesting, kind of that, does absence prove the evidence sort of thing. So this is what we get when we kind of look at these studies that refer to leave-taking cross-culturally. But notably, and something I think is important to mention, is that none of these studies are kind of rigorous cross-cultural studies. None of them go out to directly compare what we see group to group in the same way. A lot of it is ethnography, very useful and very detailed ethnography, but we do lack some kind of rigorous cross-cultural, cross-societal studies. Okay, some of what we also know about leave-taking does come from developmental evidence and into the kind of psychology realm. There's a few interesting studies that I've pulled out here. So Gleason and Weintraub say that the bye-bye signal in young children is one of the first to emerge, which is really interesting, that across cultures. Hardy in 2011 has made a comparison between some of the separation behaviors we see in young children, crying, reaching out, trying to touch the other individual, made a parallel between those behaviors and what we see in adult, more developed leave-taking. So perhaps some link there to attachment, to separation, an interesting avenue to think about. I'm really interestingly as well, Graffenhain, this is something I will come back to when I talk more about my research. Graffenhain did a really interesting study, kind of actually about something else, but part of what they did was show that in young children, I think 2 or 3 years of age, they're more likely to say goodbye to another child if they have been playing together, and if they've been doing an activity together, rather than playing nearby each other, but playing separate games. That's a really interesting study, and as I say, I will come back to that one and touch on that a little bit. And then we also have Goffman as well, and he talks quite a bit about failed leave takings. So this is when leave takings happen, but not quite in the way we expect, or not quite in the right way, to kind of fulfill these cultural norms. And one that he picks up on is when children say goodbye in the wrong context. So for example, on a bus, walking off the bus, they wave goodbye to everyone, and we all think that's cute and funny, maybe a bit silly, because we know we would never say goodbye in that context if we'd not really been interacting with those individuals. So they're saying goodbye to people even if they've not been interacting with them, and that's okay because they're kids, but it violates one of these expectations of leave taking. So all of that quite interesting, I think. We also have quite a lot of evidence that comes from linguistics studies. Now, this isn't my area at all, but there's some really interesting things that I have found. Tried to illustrate them here. This was a bit more tricky. So Albert and Kessler look at these kind of categories of words that happen towards the end of conversations. And so they come up with a number of categories that they find. Some are kind of affirmations, some are the continuation of the relationship, something like see you next week, reference to when you'll meet again, well wishes, warm expressions of friendship, that kind of thing. So they show that these phrases, these kinds of phrases, increase in that terminal part of the conversation. Shigloff and Sachs as well, they show that some of these phrases, the words that don't mean a lot, okay, all right, right, fine, these also increase towards the end of the conversation. And also another interesting study by Tang in 2007, a bit more recent, showed that in telephone conversations, when you don't have the non-verbal behaviors to back up the conversation, the verbal the verbal ways of ending the conversation increase. And they hypothesize that that is to compensate for the lack of ability to use nonverbal behaviors. So I think all of this is really interesting, and we can kind of pull out some ideas that we have here about human leave taking. What is also probably important to mention is that often these things are not studies of leave taking in their own right. They're often together with studies of greeting or even other social behaviors, and very few of them are the study of leave taking in itself. So what about comparative evidence? Obviously, I'm a primatologist, and I'm interested in primates, and I'm interested in what they can tell us about how we evolved and how our behaviors evolved. And we have a little bit of comparative evidence. You might think it looks like quite a lot from the pictures here, but a lot of it is very short anecdotal reports. We have a couple from De Waal in the same book, actually, in 2007. And one is a chimpanzee. So this was a chimpanzee raised in captivity who was able to be taught the bye-bye gesture. Obviously, this is a single chimpanzee and in captivity and being taught British Sign Language or American Sign Language, I think. But nonetheless, that's one example. And we also have a gorilla who, again, in captivity, would pat the keeper on the head before they would go inside at the end of the day, seemingly foreshadowing that end of their interaction during that day. But both of those are kind of one-offs, very interesting one-offs, I think, and perhaps something to explore further. But yeah, just anecdotes there. We also have this really interesting study recently by Heeson et al., which I was very interested to read, and this looks at captive chimpanzees and bonobos. And they do find that there are some behaviors that seem to happen at their ends of their joint commitments. They call them exits of joint commitments. What we don't know yet is how this compares to what happens when they leave the kind of proximity, being close together. So that would be really interesting to follow that up. But nonetheless, very interesting insight into what happens to end these joint commitments. And a couple of other things just to mention as well. A article published in 2016 by McGrew and myself. We gave a questionnaire to researchers at wild chimpanzee sites and asked them whether they'd ever seen chimpanzee greeting, or whether they'd ever seen chimpanzee leave taking. And we purposefully did not give explicit definitions of what these things meant. We wanted to start with that point. And the results were unanimous. Everyone said that they'd seen greeting in their chimpanzees and that they hadn't seen leave taking. Of course, it doesn't take a lot to work out that this was probably because we were not specific about what they were looking for, but nonetheless, it shows that it doesn't seem there's some obvious behavior for leave taking. Now, whether actually something exists is obviously the next question. Also, this very interesting study by Schumann et al., which was on grey mouse lemurs and shows that they seem to have greeting behaviors between mother-infant dyads. The mothers leave the infants in tree holes while they go and forage. They had greeting when they came together, but didn't seem to show any behavior when they parted. But interesting that there was some interest there in the kind of leave-taking behavior, although they didn't find anything. Okay, so I hope that gives you a bit of a background to leave taking and kind of the point at which I started trying to tackle this problem, really. Now what I'm going to do is zoom out and go to the next hexagon and talk a bit about what some of these problems were. What were the kind of issues that I had to deal with in trying to construct this research? And that's really a big theme of this talk and my project generally, I guess, is not just the leave taking, but how to develop the project to overcome some of these gaps and how to kind of fix some of the issues. So I really like this quote from Goffman. If anyone has heard me talk before, I'm sure you will have heard this quote before, because it's every PhD's nightmare, right? To see this written down, that your project is hard. Thank you, Goffman. I probably knew this already, but he says that many higher animals clearly engage in greetings, but an animal version of goodbye is much harder to establish. And I think we can agree with that quote. But it's quite nice to sum up the problem. So let's talk a little bit about what these problems are. So I've grouped them into three kinds of problem: the literature, kind of theoretical problems, and methodological problems. Let me show you this first. So this is something I made. Let's see, we can zoom in here. So doesn't really matter what the numbers are for the purpose of this talk, but this was something that I did kind of incidentally as part of my kind of literature search, and found it so interesting that I ended up writing a bit about it as part of my thesis. And what this is aiming to show is the kind of 30 key publications that define leave taking. There are others that mention it, but these are the ones that seem to define it properly, I suppose. And these are kind of, the top 30. And so what this is a citation network. Some of you may be familiar with these. I was not so familiar until I did this piece of research. And what it aims to do is look at the connections between publications. So every time a publication cites another publication, the one being cited gets an arrow towards it. So as you can see, we don't need to go into it in so much detail, but as you can see, some are very popular. Number 16 is popular, number 24 is quite popular. So you get a couple of, this is normal kind of hubs in the literature, things that really seem to be kind of milestone papers. But what's unusual about leave taking, as opposed to some other topics, is that it's almost like this topic never really took off. So although number 16 is cited quite a lot, there's still a number of papers that never actually make reference to number 16. Equally, there's a number of papers that are never referenced by anything else in terms of leave taking. So this is about which publications in leave taking reference other publications in leave taking. And obviously, there's also a kind of time element of this. Ones that are published before other papers can't reference newer papers, if that makes sense. But basically the point is that I don't have this graph here today, but if I was to do a comparison of this with greeting, you would see a much more connected network, and you do in lots of different topics as well. What we see here is quite a disconnected topic, and this strikes me as interesting, and it also strikes me that it's similar to how I felt when I really read the literature, was that people were sometimes trying to reinvent the wheel a little bit. There was little reference to historical literature, which I think is very important in developing new ideas. And yeah, you get this kind of disjointed literature, and someone needs to kind of pull it all together. I'm hoping that person will be me. But yes, that gives you an idea of kind of the first problem, the literature problem. So let's zoom out again and go on to the next set of problems, which are kind of the theoretical problems. And I make a claim here that our understanding of leave taking is really limited by the way that we think about it. And so one of these things in terms of how we think about it is the definition of leave taking. And when I looked through these kind of, the top 30 papers that I mentioned in the previous graph, how they define leave taking varied wildly. And I think part of this is a reflection of the fact that they come from such different disciplines. So we've got linguistic studies, we've got comparative studies, we've got ethnographies, we've got some kind of ethology, human behavior type studies. So perhaps, and that's fine, you need to define things in terms of what's useful for your study, but there seemed to kind of be little consensus about what we were actually talking about. And it was also something that I found very difficult. How do I actually define this concept in a way that's useful, in a way that's measurable, and in a way that will help me try to answer some of the research questions? So I've just sort of highlighted the problem here, and in the case study, I'll tell you how I address the problem. But here are the kind of 30 definitions that I talked about. And what I've done is just show you how they're broken down by component. So for example, most of them mention that it should be to do with separation. That's good. Actually, not all of them did mention it. So yeah, nearly 100% of them mentioned that leave taking was something to do with separation. Not that many of them mention that leave taking should be connected to social interaction, although this has come to be something that I think is important. But about half of the definitions mention social interaction in there. And as you can see, there's a few other things. So the functionality of leave taking, the ritual aspect of leave taking, and even conversation. Using conversation in the definition is probably great if you're doing a linguistic study, but that makes it quite difficult to then apply to other contexts. So this was kind of, the next thing to tackle in terms of definition. What are we talking about? And the other thing I wanted to introduce to you is this idea. Now, hopefully I can zoom in on my picture. Here we go. Oh, that's a bit blurry. I'll zoom out. You can still get the idea. So this is the idea of the levels of separation. And this came to me because I realized that when we were talking about humans, and when I was reading about humans in some of those studies that I mentioned at the beginning, The separation we were talking about was quite kind of intimate separations. So ends of conversations, you know, turning away after having a conversation, professors and students, that was a common setup for some of the studies, children dropping their kids off at nursery, things like this. And that's fine. And in some of the references to leave taking in non-human primates, it seemed that we were assuming kind of longer term separations. There was some reference to sort of the fission fusion of groups, these kind of big group separations. And I think they're probably super important as well. It's not that I don't think any of these are not important, but I think there was sort of a lack of being conscious that this was another variable that could vary between leave takings and what we mean by leave taking. So one thing I've tried to do, and I'm sorry that this image seems to not have come out as so high resolution, but hopefully you can see. So this yellow, the yellow part here is what I've called these kind of daily recurrent separations, these things that happen all the time. It could even be within a room. You know, you're at a party, you're mingling with different groups of people, going between friends, you still end your interaction in a certain way. And then we have the kind of green circle, which shows some temporary but extended separations. So you know, perhaps going on holiday, perhaps going to university for the term, you'll see your family at Christmas, something like that. And then we have the permanent separation. So could include death, although that could be another topic of conversation as well. It could include moving away. You know, you'll never see your neighbors again, but you've interacted with them before. So I think this is something that is an area to further develop for sure, but it's something that strikes me as very important. I think when we consider leave taking, we need to consider at what level are people separating, and how does that translate into the data you're collecting and the way that we conceptualize leave taking. Okay, so there's some of the theoretical problems that I've come across. I'll talk a bit quickly about the kind of methodological problems, and then I'll be able to go and give you my example. So as well as leave taking studies being limited by the way that we think about it, I also think that they're limited by the way we actually do it, how we actually practically tackle these problems. Excuse me. And one of these things is the data collection. So these are some things that I've noticed, but they've also been made reference to in some previous publications as well. So data collection pretty much relies on video technology and video archive collection, and I'll talk a bit about what I've done in terms of that soon. Partly because of the nature of leave taking happening before a separation, especially if it's something that's not always obvious, it makes the most sense to record everything and rewind. Now maybe there's some other way to do it, but I've not come up with it, and I think you know, this is a good way to tackle it. And so without cheap video technology that's easy to carry, that's easy to, you know, upload onto your laptop, this becomes quite tricky. Also in terms of the software that we're using for behavioral coding, that can be quite tricky. If it's not easy to rewind your videos to code the behaviors, this can affect the data collection. And also maybe a bit of an obvious one, but this assumption that it just doesn't exist in non-human species. I've definitely talked to lots of people that have said, it just doesn't seem that likely that something exists. If it did, someone would already have found it. The other thing in terms of methods is what we're choosing as our candidate behaviors. That's what I'm calling the behaviors that we're investigating to see if they could possibly be leave taking. So how do we choose them? What behaviors do we choose? There's very little leave taking literature to go off, even in humans. So how we go about this is tricky, how to choose them. In some studies, only choosing verbal behaviors. Well, we know from knowledge of primate literature in general that gestures and non-verbal movements are very important. So I think that's a bit of a gap. And as I've said, these behaviors possibly not being obvious, you know, I highly doubt that a baboon is going to stand up and wave, say cheerio, and wander off. We're looking here for kind of patterns of behavior that are a bit more subtle. And the final thing that I want to talk about is the control variables, and I think this is super important. So even though there have been some empirical studies and emphasis on the fact that very few of the studies I discussed are empirical in terms of collecting data and doing analysis, many of them don't control for various factors. So one thing that few studies control for is actually the length of the interaction. And Lockhart actually mentions this in 1980. She says that this is very important because behaviors could just happen more towards the end of interactions because individuals get bored. They want to move off. It's not really a leave-taking behavior so much as it's a boredom behavior, perhaps. The other thing, and this goes back to that I mentioned about the Grafenhain, children playing together are more likely to say goodbye than children playing near each other separately. We have a lack of control for whether it's really the social condition that's driving these behaviors. I'll expand on this in my own example. And it's also very important to account for ID as well, obviously, especially if you have individuals overrepresented in your sample, as I have. It's important to control for that, because some individuals doing behaviors more would then lead to pseudo replication in the sample. So all of these things are very important, and maybe don't exist so much in some of the studies that currently exist. So hopefully that outlines some of these problems that I encountered, and quite a lot of problems. I think I'm sure everyone encounters problems, but yes, difficult to kind of tackle all these at once from such little literature. So this was what I was up against. Excuse me. So I'm going to zoom in now and tell you a bit about my experience and my kind of case study on baboons. And this forms the first part of my PhD, and I'm going off now to do further research in this area. So I'm sure there'll be some questions about that as well, but I'll tell you what I've done thus far. Got this nice quote from Darwin. It would not be a primate evolution talk without a Darwin quote. So baboons, very useful for understanding humans, and I'll talk very briefly about that now. So as many of you may know, we use primates a lot, and in this lab we're mostly primate people, to try and infer how human behaviors evolved. And obviously we're closely related to all primates. In particular, baboons and humans share a common ancestor, somewhere around 35 million years ago, before the split with what are now the great apes. And so understanding similarities or differences between humans and baboons can tell us a lot about how human behavior has developed and how human behavior has evolved. And we can even try and understand why some of those behaviors may exist by understanding kind of what exists in other primate species. And in particular, baboons are a great example. They're largely terrestrial, social animals. They're similar to humans in lots of ways, and they also had kind of similar radiations to hominins. So they're a good species to study. And in terms of those kind of levels of the separation that I talked about, those kind of going between different interactions, this was one reason that I was particularly interested to choose the baboons as my study species, because they don't have what we'd know of as traditional fission fusion like chimpanzees or spider monkeys, or species like that. They're generally a cohesive group, but they do go and forage and groom in smaller groups within their big group. And I think that's really interesting, and actually gives this opportunity for us to see how the interactions within individuals end, even if they're still in the same kind of main group. So that's another reason why I chose baboons. As Renee mentioned in the introduction, I did my fieldwork in Gorongosa, which is where many people in our lab have also worked, and where some of our lab are there now, which is very exciting. And I went there in 2018 to collect my data. And I worked with a group of baboons in the Shutengo camp, of which there's around 37 individuals. I will show you this cute photo. I love this photo. I also use this one on a lot of my talks. I think it's very David Attenborough. As you can see, the point of showing you this photo, other than it being quite cute, is that you can get high definition, close range observations of these animals. And that was very important for me. I couldn't go and study the same troops as some of my colleagues because the kind of close range was not available in those other troops, and so would not allow me to get close-up behavioral records of them. So I will also show you this photo of me that you may have seen on the poster. There I am with a camera and an iPad. And so what I was doing basically was videoing. I did a lot of videoing over the time I was there in Gorongosa. and I was trying to build up a record of videos of the baboons that I could then later go and analyze and collect data from to tackle my questions of leave taking. So at the same time, it was important to collect the videos and also to try and ID the individuals and collect some other contextual data as well. So that's what I'm doing there, and that was in a nutshell my kind of plan and a method while I was there. So what did I do after that? So then I had to think about, while I was doing that, think about how I was tackling these various problems that I talked about. So now I'm going to go back to some of the problems I talked about and try and explain how I managed to tackle the issues. So yes, in terms of there being issues with the way we think about it and the way we tackle it, this was what I was trying to do. So on the theoretical side, I've reproduced this image again. I think, yes, this one's slightly better quality. Anyway, hopefully you can see that. My idea was basically to focus on these daily recurrent separations, partly because that's what happens most frequently in baboons. It would give me a better data set and give me more opportunities to look at options for leave taking. But I'm also really interested in this kind of as a starting point for how we conceptualize leave taking. Equivalent to perhaps saying goodbye on the phone, to saying goodbye, when you go to work, those kind of things, as opposed to any prolonged separation. Is there still ways that individuals end their interactions? And this really kind of intrigued me. So I tried to use this idea that I'd introduced to apply it to the baboons. And I also have this definition. I'm sure it draws on lots of the other definitions that I had, so hopefully it won't be too much of a surprise, but behaviors habitually occurring before intended separation from social interaction. And each of those kind of keywords in the definition was quite important. The fact they're happening habitually, obviously these should be behaviors that are happening generally all the time, pretty much when individuals separate. They should be before separation, because that seems to be the key thing of leave taking, right? If greeting is when individuals come together, leave taking should be when they go apart again. So that was very important. The intended separation, tricky one. I know, intention of leave taking is a slightly different topic that is in my upcoming results and research. But in terms of intended separation, the reason that was included was because I realized during my fieldwork that often individuals would separate because they'd sort of been forced to separate, right? Someone would walk between the group, a car would drive past and they would run in all directions. And I realized that that was going to skew my data because they weren't meaning to separate. It was not really an intended end of their social interaction. They'd have sat there for another 20 minutes if they could. So this idea that they hadn't been interrupted, essentially, that became a variable that I coded, and that I excluded from this kind of analysis because this separation should be intended. And from social interaction, this again forms another important point, which I'll talk about in a sec. That for me, it was very important that I was looking at social interaction. So I really wanted to know whether these behaviors were happening as a way to end social interactions, because that's what we see in humans. Goffman talks a bit about these failed leave takings that I mentioned at the beginning. And, we don't expect leave taking to happen usually if you've been sat next to someone on the bus, both sat on your phones or reading a book. We don't expect you to then give a goodbye. You might smile, perhaps there would be something, but it's not leave taking in the way that we really think of it. So it's important that that we're really thinking about social separation, or it was to me at least. So addressing these things methodologically. So here is a still image from one of my videos. As you can see, this is the kind of thing that I was looking at. And in terms of my data collection, this is a screenshot, which hopefully I can enlarge. There we go. From Boris, which was the software that I used to collect the data. Some of you I know are familiar with it, and some may not be, but it's free software. And it's really great. You create an ethogram, all the behaviors you want to collect, and you make that match up to the keys on your keyboard. So you can code the behaviors. When you see a behavior, you press P for play, and it records that, etc. So you get these time-stamped behaviors. You upload your videos into it, and you get time-stamped behaviors that are associated with each video clip. And so this is what I did. I went through my videos and looked through them for the behaviors I was interested in. And speaking of behaviors I was interested in, I obviously collected lots of different data, but the kind of most important ones in terms of what I was considering as possible leave-taking behaviors were these three: the eye gaze in the direction of parting, self-directed touch, including self-scratching, and shifting orientation in the direction of parting. And yeah, this was a tricky thing really, because these came about from a number of avenues, I guess. Partly these came about from the observations I did kind of live of the individuals when I was watching them in Mozambique. I obviously had a lot of time on my hands while I was sat videoing and kind of watching and seeing what was going on myself. And so I tried to get a sense of what was going on, even though that wasn't the official data collection that I did later with Boris. So that was partly where it came from. But I was also really wanted to try and take inspiration from what we did know of the human literature. And this was hard because there was few kind of ethological studies, lots of descriptive studies, and lots of things that were linguistically or culturally specific, I guess, which, you know, become difficult if you try and, you know, use those as inspiration. There's no elaborate leave taken here, so that's difficult. But this idea of orientation, this idea of kind of fumbling or self-touching, I've seen kind of memes and people joke about kind of slapping your thighs before you stand up to walk off. That's a form of self-directed touch. Gazing in the direction you're going to head off in is something that's also mentioned. So these seemed like avenues to explore. So that's what I began with. And in terms of the control variables, I mentioned how important I thought it was to control for various things. So these are some of the things that I controlled for as well. So the individual ID, the activity duration, the idea of the boredom that I mentioned with Lockhart earlier, the type of parting, which I'll tell you about now, and whether the individual followed after they left, whether they were interrupted. So that helped me work out that idea of intended separation. And in terms of parting types, so I know I keep kind of mentioning this, and I've not shown you this bit yet, but I hope you can see my little cartoon type baboons here. I was really interested to try and infer from this kind of first set of results whether any behaviors that may be happening were really ways to end social interaction. So the joint activity. So, you know, I talked about the children playing together as opposed to playing near each other, but separately. That's kind of what inspired this part. And also just from a kind of logical point of view of how can I try and demonstrate that this is something happening socially. So that's what I did. The one in the middle, the activity were joint activities where individuals were doing something together. So in my data set, obviously this is somewhat limited given the context, but it was usually grooming, occasionally playing, things like that. The one on the right, proximity, these were activities done close together, so within a meter of each other, but not intrinsically joint as an activity. So maybe things like foraging separately, resting separately, they were the most common activities. And then I also included a solo thing as well as a kind of control, so individuals on their own that just move more than a meter away. So this meter obviously is the constant here. A meter was what I was using as separation, just for the purpose of this study, and this was estimated using an estimate on Boris as well. But hopefully you can see kind of the logic behind this part of the study, and I think this really underpins the kind of purpose and point and outcome of my research for now, which is that yes, I really wanted to use this comparison to say whether things were happening socially that weren't happening when individuals either were alone or when they were not engaged in something social. So I hope that makes sense. Okay, and so that is basically how I tackled some of those and some of the methods that I used. Obviously a brief whistle-stop tour, but I think that gives a bit of a summary there. And hopefully now I can share with you some of the results. So I did some multivariate GLMs. Basically, this means that I considered the three candidate behaviors. So the eye gaze, the orientation, and the self-scratch were considered in one analysis, and I was basically looking to say whether the parting type had an effect on the behavior. That was the simple thing that I was looking at, and I controlled for those various things in the models that I talked about, such as the ID as well, and the duration of the activity. And to cut straight to the chase, the results showed that social separation specifically did drive certain behaviors, especially the orientation in the direction of parting. That was the one that seemed to be most specific. Yeah, so that's super exciting. It basically meant that in social situations, when they were grooming or when they were playing, individuals were more likely to orientate themselves in the way they were going to go in the window before they separate. So I used a 2-minute window before separation to measure that. And I did it in 2 ways, as you can see here: presence and frequency. So I measured whether those behaviors happened. Did they orientate themselves in the direction of parting? Yes or no. Did they self-scratch? Yes or no. Self-directed touch. Did they show eye gaze in the direction of parting? Yes or no, in that 2-minute window. And then also in that 2-minute window, I counted a frequency, not for orientation, but for the eye gaze and the self-directed touch, a frequency of how many occurrences, how many occurrences of that behavior happened in that window. And hopefully I can show you a bit of a visual form as well that backs up the results of the model. So this is a little image created with the R package called VisReg. I don't know if anyone is familiar, but basically it shows you the relationship between an explanatory and a response variable while you can control for other things. So I did a simple version here. So the 3 behaviors: orientation, eye gaze, and self-scratch, while controlling for the duration and the ID. And so orientation is the one that was kind of significant here. In the social category, they were more likely to orientate in the direction of parting. Actually, interestingly, self-scratch was also significant, but not in the social category. They were much more likely to self-scratch when they were leaving a solo condition. So that's not exactly what I was originally interested in, but is interesting nonetheless, and something I will hopefully follow up there as well. And hopefully you can see the kind of the frequency side as well. Possibly less interesting because not significant, but we shouldn't ignore non-significant results. This was counting the frequency of these things, and eye gaze wasn't significant in any situation. I guess that makes sense. Perhaps the reason they do look in the way they're going to go before they leave, but there was no difference between the groups. And maybe why would there be? You know, they're just as likely to look where they're going to go if they're on their own as they are when they're together. So actually, that's quite a nice result in that sense. There's no social condition associated with eye gaze. But for self-scratch, again, it was more likely to happen more frequently in the solo condition. So something interesting there. Probably some of you know, self-scratching and self-directed touch is a measure of anxiety. It's been studied quite a lot, so that could kind of relate to that sort of literature. So really interesting. So yeah, this was the kind of summary of the results. Obviously, again, a brief kind of explanation of that, but particularly looking at those categories of type of parting, I think this is the first kind of quite convincing evidence that I've put together to show that something is happening in those social conditions. I'm just aware of the time, so I'm going to move on now and just talk a little bit about the conclusions in a couple of minutes. So I really like this quote from Lockhart again, from Knapp, and forgive me for all the quotes, but I think it's quite nice when I've got such little literature to go off. But they say that although leave-taking may seem to be mundane, unique and terribly human interpersonal forces are unleashed when people say goodbye to one another. And I would say that perhaps strong interpersonal forces, but maybe not terribly human or unique in that sense, which is really exciting to kind of challenge some of those assumptions. And I think was a lot of assumptions there. So I've got 3 kind of novel contributions, I think, so far, and I hope to build on these obviously with the rest of what I'm working on, but a novel area of research, novel methods, and also novel implications as well. So in terms of the novel research area, this was the first study that only looked at leave taking in non-human primates. Other studies have always looked at greeting or something else. It was the first study on leave taking at all in baboons, which I think is really exciting to kind of enter into new territory. And it was also the first study of leave taking on any wild population. I can definitely see why. I think it's one of those things that's hard to study in the wild, I think, with all the kind of extra variables and things to consider. It's tricky. So I think there were kind of three things that I ventured into in terms of the research area. In terms of the methods, this was the first study to use those controls, especially that comparison of social and non-social parting types that I think is really important. It's also the first study, to my knowledge at least, that tries to connect some of those human literature methods and possible candidate behaviors into the non-human world, into the non-human literature. And it's also the first foray into this idea of the levels of separation, of making that really explicit, that it's important sort of at what level we're discussing separating. And then finally, the implications, and I hope you'll share some excitement with these. So this is the first study that suggests the origins of leaf taking are really very deep in our evolutionary lineage, in our history, even before the emergence of great apes. So some of these shared behaviors we have with baboons could suggest, and of course needs further work, but could suggest that actually the origins of leaf taking, though of course more developed and more obvious in humans, actually have an ancient origin. It's the first study to highlight these parallels between non-human primates and humans, especially in terms of form. So there is some kind of ethnography and brief mention to things like what direction you face when you're in a group and when you're navigating social settings in humans. And I'm really interested in exploring that a bit further, because this could be kind of the first evidence that some of that has origins in our primate history. And crucially, and this I think is my real take-home message, the first study to provide this sort of evidence that non-humans end social interactions in ways that they do not in asocial interactions. That's really important, I think. Whether this is intentional, I'm hoping to look at some markers of intentionality now, or I am looking at some markers of intentionality in my current analysis at the minute. So I'm hoping that could be the kind of next stage, really, to see whether there are things they do that adjust for the audience, adjust for presence of certain individuals, and are done when other individuals are paying attention, those kind of things that suggest intentionality. But the first step is to show that it seems to happen in social conditions. So that's really, really exciting, I think. And so that's pretty much it. I hope that you've enjoyed the story of leaf taking, from the fragmented literature to the problems that I tried to tackle, and the first kind of results that have come out of this research. And I hope you will continue to kind of follow my journey as I tackle some remaining questions, I think, and I'm sure there will be some questions about this, but there's lots of outstanding questions that this opens up the doors for, and yeah, that's really exciting. I think this research is really really fascinating, because it opens up so many other opportunities, not least for also applying this to other species and in other contexts and things like that. And so with that, I just wanted to thank everyone, my supervisors, obviously Susanna and Harvey, and everyone in Gorongosa and the baboons, and also all the various funding that I've had to be able to do this project, and all of you for listening. And yeah, I hope that there's lots of good questions and that you've enjoyed the talk today.
Thank you so much, Lucy. I think we have enjoyed the talk. It's a fascinating topic. And we do have some questions from the audience, so I will address some of these to you. And let me see here. So first set of questions that we have deal with variation in leaf taking. And first would be, how much would you expect there to be intergroup variation in leaf taking behavior? And do you think there will be cultural differences between groups, or the leaf-taking actions to be common across troops, referring to the baboons that you have been studying?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would love to expand this and really answer that. I think from what we know of humans, I guess, which is little, obviously, but I think from what we know of humans, there seems to be this suggestion that some of the behaviors are rooted in kind of universals, but there obviously is such significant cultural variation. So on that front, I guess you could predict that the similar kind of pattern could be seen in baboons. I think it's really hard because the behaviors are so subtle and so not elaborate. I guess that it would be hard to really make predictions about exactly what would vary. But I think it's such an interesting area, and I think that's a kind of real obvious next avenue for research, really.
Very good. The next question here, do social bonds between individuals affect leave-taking behavior? Have you been able to?
Yeah, great question. And that's coming up, that's in the works at the minute. My feeling is, yes, that it is quite likely. I don't know, yeah, I'm still working on the analysis, so I don't have any kind of final answers for this question, but my feeling is that the way it happens in sort of in such social interactions like grooming, that it seems likely that social bonds would play a role. We know that that's similar in greeting as well. So I think, yeah, hopefully in the next update, there will be some more final answers on that. But my feeling is that, yes, that would be the case.
Excellent. Look forward to that. Following question. Do leave-taking behaviors vary depending on whether the individual was separating from a single individual or a group of individuals?
Really good question. Yes, I didn't mention this in the talk, and I probably should have done, but for the purpose of this analysis, I only looked at dyads at two individuals separating. And the reason was that, yeah, a lot of the groups that would separate were younger individuals that were hard to ID, hard to record the behaviors, very kind of quick and difficult to really get accurate coding of that window of separation. So I don't know the answer. And yeah, just to clarify that it was on dyads only. My feeling is, again, probably yes. And yeah, I would like to extend the research in that direction. I think we know that is the case in humans. And so I think, again, it would be interesting to apply that to non-human primates. Oh, sorry, I can't hear you.
Okay, back on. The next question here. Were some individuals more likely to leave social interactions first? For example, higher ranking individuals or older individuals?
Yes, I think that yes, that was the case. So yes, higher, well, yes, I think it was almost like individuals that kind of would maximize their social maximize their social interactions, so go off and interact with a lot of other individuals often, and I'm trying to look at this now actually, but individuals that would go off and move to other social interactions as opposed to just wandering off and foraging. So I think there's sort of a social element to who was leaving, and I think that was also why it was really important to include the IDs in the analysis too, because there were certain individuals that were much more likely to have the solo, be on their own basically, and do those solo movements away. Often individual adult males would often be on their own resting, or so that was quite interesting to kind of try and get a sense of those patterns of who was doing what.
Now we have a couple of questions here relating to comparisons to humans. And one of the questions is, did orienting in direction of travel come up as something in the human literature during
yeah a little bit. So the human literature is so I know I tried to show a real range of what there was at the beginning, but sometimes those things were just mere mentions in other passages, so really hard to get a sense. It's definitely not like any literature I've really read before that seems more detailed, but there were a few mentions. So one is, and I've forgotten kind of what that type of literature is called, but these kind of social group formation type literatures, who stands where, that kind of thing. The idea of turning away before you exit a group came up then. I think kind of some of the Kendon literature. I don't know if anyone is familiar. And the other place that it sort of came up a little bit was to do with this idea of children and attachment, and the idea that sometimes children turn away, almost as it described it as kind of like a threat, almost like a threat of, if you don't play with me or interact with me, I'll leave, and so I'll turn away. And that was quite interesting. I actually came across that much more recently, in the last several months. And I found that very interesting, because a lot of this does seem to go back to the kind of developmental idea, and so perhaps there is something in that. But yes, definitely interested to investigate that further, especially having found these results.
And in fact, the next question we have relates precisely to that point that you just made. And it is, since you talked about the development of leave-taking in human infants and children, would you intend to research this in baboon troops as well?
I'd be so interested too. I was looking through the data I've already got, and wondering if there's anything I can do with what I've already got. I don't know if my sample size is really big enough, but really interesting. And from some of us, I know there's a few baboon people probably listening, that the kind of infant stealing and that kind of thing, really interesting. And I would love to do something with that. Now, whether I've got enough right now is a good question, but my feeling really is that there's something more to be done developmentally, I think.
Another question here, Lucy, if we may. So this related to chimpanzees. How would you explain the differences between the results of your survey on leave-taking with wild chimpanzees, where there's apparently an absence of some of these behaviors, and the captive study published recently by Hissen et al.?
Yeah, I think so. Yes, the apparent absence in chimpanzees was never something that I took that seriously. Perhaps I think the way we maybe sort of set that up really, and I suppose what we were really asking in that questionnaire in 2016 in that article was not so much does greeting happen and does leave taking happen, but kind of are people aware of it, and I think that's what that showed really, was that everyone kind of knows and assumes greeting is really common, not just in primates, but in other animal species as well, lots of animal species, and people either haven't seen or aren't aware or haven't thought about leave taking in other species. So I think that was more of a reflection of what we know than what actually exists, and so it's really interesting that Hissen and colleagues have investigated that on a more detailed level, actually setting out to look for that evidence.
And back to your Chitengo troop. So the Chitengo baboons live around other monkeys as well as humans. And do you think that that this fact of having humans around could have affected any aspect of their leave-taking behaviors? The question refers to social learning, but are there any aspects that that might have affected those behaviors?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think for anyone that is familiar with Gorongosa, these baboons are they're in a very anthropogenic environment. They're always raiding the bins, and we were just talking about them entering the offices and things recently. So there's definitely lots of ways that it affects their population, I suppose. Now, whether that really affects leave taking is a really good question, and I suppose without looking at some of that possible cultural variation between groups, that would be really interesting to look at. Hard to know the answer. I think it's definitely possible. I think one thing I'm interested in is kind of what the function of leave taking is, and something that I'm trying to look at also at the moment. And so I think depending on whether the environment does affect things like their social bonding, whether it affects things like their the way they deal with kind of valuable resources, things like this, I think it definitely could play a role. But yes, unknown at the moment, I suppose. And I think this is kind of crying out for exploration into other populations, really, to do that comparison.
And Lucy, thinking more broadly about species across different taxonomic groups.
Mm.
Is there a role of theory of mind in 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 some of these behaviors?
Yeah, really good question. And yeah, I guess it's something I've been thinking out a bit with this idea of are these behaviors intentional? And I think, yeah, that's sort of what we've got to look at now, really. I think understanding yourself and understanding what others understand about you surely plays a role in human leave taking. I think, to my knowledge, it hasn't been published or written about in humans either, but I think it all seems to be based on understanding of relationships, understanding of even of things like separation, even of mortality. I think that's been mentioned too, this idea that when you separate, that might be the last time you see someone, and perhaps our understanding of the future and things like that plays a role. So theory of mind, yes, really could be very important. I guess there's no knowing from the results I've got at the minute whether that just happens because of some kind of heightened social in the moment awareness that interaction is ending. I don't think what I've got now proves or disproves anything other than something happens in social situations, but really interesting. And I think when we venture into this idea of intentional behaviors and things like that, if possible, that would be really interesting to look at.
And the graph that you showed of connectedness, I thought was a really interesting one, a very nice one, showing the literature, and I guess in this case the lack of a lot of interconnected referencing. And as you mentioned, this refers to a field that is still emerging, so to speak. And you did use the expression of reinventing the wheel. What would you say? Where was the main challenge of the main challenges of doing this work? I know you've been thinking about this issue for quite a long time. What would be the main challenges for you, and how will you be able to overcome some of these in a field that where there's no clear path that's been laid out before you, as is the case for most of the research that we do?
Yes, no, good question. Biggest challenges, I think that's just it, really, is that even what there was very little, and even what there was almost just in totally different directions, totally different definitions, just completely different concepts of what we were even talking about. So even trying to pull together, I mean, I think part of the reason that I've not really been able to explore some of the developmental stuff until a bit more recently was because it's not even referred to as leave taking. It's not in any literature to do with greetings and goodbyes or anything. It's so a lot of what you find is really comes about from such disparate sort of areas of research, and not always in the areas I'm familiar with either. So I was reading a lot of linguistics and psychology and ethnography, and sometimes they support each other really well, and sometimes they just seem to be telling such different stories and just giving very little as well in terms of the leave taking. So I think that was just was a huge challenge, really, both in terms of how to start writing about it, but also how I should conceptualize it, really, because there was such variation in what people understand it to mean, I guess.
Yeah, good points. Here we have another comment, Lucy, and the comment is, "Awesome work, Lucy!" Exclamation
That's
mark.
kind, thank you.
Did you explore how age and sex affects patterns of leave taking in your focal baboon troop?
Yes. So yeah, I looked at this particularly in some descriptive work that I did initially. Now, one thing that was a limitation of this research so far was that the juvenile individuals were really hard to identify. This was sort of the first period of time where these individuals were being identified, the first kind of few years. Which is really exciting, but it also meant that, some of the juveniles were hard. Most of the juveniles were hard to identify. So in the kind of formal statistics and the models, the juveniles were not included, but sex was. And I'm going to look a bit more into that soon as well. I think that's really interesting. Someone asked before about who was leaving more. And from my data, at least, it seemed that, especially in male-female pairs, females would seem to move away a lot more and almost mingle a lot more, and males seemed more solitary, but also more sort of stationary. So that's interesting to kind of think about. And I think definitely further down the line, I'm expecting some sex differences in terms of some of the other features of leave taking that I hope to look at. I think it's really interesting, and I wish I could look at age, especially with some of the questions on the kind of developmental stuff. I'd be really interested to know more about that.
Very good. We have another question here that has to do more with phylogeny and evolutionary patterns. Phylogenetically, how strong do you consider the assumption that leave taking corresponds to a discrete cognitive module prone to evolutionary pressure? And if I may add to that, you have discussed this idea that leave taking has deep evolutionary roots, and I would like to add to that just a question about convergence, possibly of a convergent evolution leading to some of these patterns in different primates or different species. So two interrelated questions about the
I really like that question.
Patterns.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, I've tried to, maybe I was quite confident in the conclusions of the actual talk, but in reality, yes, I think I'm being a bit cautious at the moment in terms of what I'm really concluding in my own head. And I think, ideally, in an ideal world, a similar method and, outline of research to what I've done would be applied across lots of species, and we could start to answer some of those questions. For example, if leave taking seems to be shared across many old world monkey species and across great apes, we might have some stronger evidence that this is, really a homologous behavior. And in terms of kind of a sort of something that evolution has acted on as a kind of discrete thing, I think that's a great question. And I think I'm hoping I'll have a bit more to add to that when I look into function of leave taking as well. I think it will be really interesting to get a sense of how and when and why leave taking is used more. At the minute, these are the first results that I think something is going on here. And if I can expand a bit more as to how this behavior really seems to be being used, I think that will give us a lot more of an idea about whether that's something that could really be evolutionarily acted on in that way, in terms of what its use is. What does it have a purpose and a function? But I think that's a great question, and that's sort of my ultimate goal, I guess, really, is to try and kind of answer it.
Very good answer, Lucy. Another question we have here is about future research. Which of the remaining of the three situations of leave taking that you mentioned do you think is most important to research next? For example, has anyone looked at any behaviors before individuals migrate away from their natal group?
Yeah, great question. For my research, I'm at the minute at least keeping on the kind of individual level recurring separations, but I think there's huge potential for the other areas as well. I'm really interested in that middle level. I think this was the level that when I first started thinking about, it seemed like the obvious choice, really, akin to perhaps chimpanzee fission fusion was something I talked about a lot. I think part of the problem is needing enough data points to be able to have a good sample size for this, but if you could do that, I think that would be fantastic. I think I know I've talked to quite a few people about this as well, that final level, this kind of permanent separation is really interesting, because on one hand, sort of, do you need to say goodbye if there's no reuniting? I think we probably would. We say goodbye when people are dying, we say goodbye when people are going to move countries, and we know we'll never really see them again. But it does put into question the way that we use leaf taking? Is it valuable to do that? And kind of why does that happen? So I think that's really interesting, but possibly in a slightly different way. I'd be interested to know the answer in non-human primates, but I think my first interest would definitely be to kind of compare the sorts of leaf takings I'm doing, where they're within a group but mingling, moving between individuals, with these more definite group separations, more like fission fusion. I think that would be great if someone had a data set that was more like on that level. I think it would be very interesting to compare, because perhaps it could be that behaviors are more elaborate with the greater separation, and that would be something really interesting to kind of add into the mix. I think we know they are in humans. I think there's lots of literature about when you say goodbye and you're just popping into the shops, you give quite a brief goodbye. When you're going on holiday, maybe more of a goodbye. And if I was going away for 6 months and wouldn't see my family, that would be a more elaborate goodbye. Bon voyage parties, things like that. So I think it would be really interesting to do the kind of temporal thing in non-human primates as well, and see if that brings anything up.
And of course, as you mentioned this, what comes to mind is the tremendous differences that we also see across human cultures. With some cultures being very expressive about saying goodbye, even for a short period of time, whereas others tend to be, less so. But quite a bit of variation across humans today. I would imagine extending that into the past would also be an interesting topic to study in some ways. But so, well, I think that's let me see, that's all the questions we have for now, Lucy. We've taken quite a lot of your time. You've given I think a wonderful, very interesting talk, and answered several questions that we posed to you. It's been a really interesting, fascinating topic. And I thank you for sharing your research with us, and for taking the time to answer all of these questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and for everyone for listening as well.
And I'd like to invite everybody for next week's Primate Conversations. We will have Bonnie Jacobs, one of the foremost paleobotanists in Africa, talking about Miocene vegetation in relation to primate evolution. And again, thank you so much, Lucy. It's been really good, really wonderful. So thank you so much. We will end the live transmission now.